Okay, you're listening to the Insight to Action Inspirational Insights podcast program. I'm your host, Dawna Jones, and today I have Tony Holmwood, who is the author of Best Behaviour, EI, and culture coach, and a consultant for his firm, OutPerf4m Consulting. Tony is in Sydney, Australia. I'm in Vancouver, Canada. So we are having this transatlantic flight. We don't have to worry about socializing, which is we're in interesting times right now, as everybody's probably noticed. Tony's a commercial accountant by profession, so we're going to have an interesting conversation in light of that professional background, I think. But Tony's also used to focusing on business performance, business transformation, and change. And his understanding of organizational development and HR really originated from working on an HR insourcing startup, which was targeted to mid-sized companies. He's got a very unique perspective on behavioral development, so I'm expecting you to have a fun conversation with him, and it's in largely response to his own personal challenges and learnings, which of course is the best source material I think any of us can have is, what have we actually learned from living life and so forth. So Tony's an accredited EI behavioral and change practitioner, and what he's done, and this is what we're going to dive into next, is he's collated the views of Freud and cognitive behavior therapy to come up with a different way of looking at what someone called the runway of life, to really present two opposing pathways. So Tony, looking forward to having this conversation with you. Let's talk about why did you even pursue the path of two pathways, and why would it be important to business at all?
Okay, well, thank you, Dawna, for having me on your program. Now, essentially, when I worked on the HR outsourcing venture, I had worked at a software company and developed a deep insight into HRMS and software and processes, and decided to leave the company and work on the startup. It was at a time that the HR outsourcing industry was taking off. So I was working against a trend whereby HR capability was being outsourced. At the same time, we were trying to insource the value into small to medium business. So obviously, the business didn't take off. We couldn't actually get it started. I think the over-encompassing trend was, HR was being devalued. So what I then did is I wrote a manuscript and I put together a framework on how HR could best work in an organization. And it was all about strategy, all about employee development, empowerment, building trust in the organization, creating an environment where HR can actually coach managers in terms of coaching employees, and to basically build that trust and what is essentially in this day turned to self-awareness and emotional growth, all about one-to-one relationships.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you're talking about two halves of life, which can be sliced a couple of ways. I mean, chronologically, it can be sliced. It can also be sliced in terms of vertical evolution, vertical development. Who am I in light of my life's experience, regardless of age? Because there's plenty of people who have really life-changing experiences at a very young age. So where does the life's two halves come in, and just what does that mean for people listening to this program right now?
Sure. So I placed HR in the second half of life, which, as well as leadership, which was all about formulating strategy and basically a future objective. So very much focused on the here and now and into the future, whereas the first part of life was all about reflection and developing a specialist identity. So, and one of the big assumptions I make in my book is that we're all born essentially in exactly the same state, which is a blank canvas, with very basic primal fears, which actually initiate our development. So, we're all extroverts, whereas with our environment, we don't have an identity. So we basically develop from the outside in terms of building skills, processes, complexity, structure, which is very much about sort of in old world terms would be left brain development. And yeah, so it's all about building our own very unique perspective from the outside in. And that's all about, building an ego, managing our esteem, but also building a specialization for us to use later in life. And that's all about the second half, when we actually transform our capability to strategically and actively implement that understanding and obviously that capability and skill set.
So is that a chronological thing, or is it a developmental thing, or is it both? How do those two intersect? When you say second half, we always think 1 and 2, but and we tend to think about it linearly, but can it also just be in terms of more of a spiraling of experience?
So the way I represent it and build it in my book is there is actually a life cycle, and there is a very sort of timely mapping of how these actually happen. So initially we develop our brain up to about the age of 3, and that's all about brain system and mind development. So as a child, the focus is on body development and building the skills and processes to actually utilize our bodies and function within our environment. Then we move into the second half, which is, as I mentioned, opposes the first half. And that's all about emotional development and relationships in the adolescent individual, and all the hormones and transformation which happens during that stage is geared to making that happen. And finally, at adult mindset, which is all about work objectives and purpose, is founded on cultural intelligence.
Okay, so that's interesting. So sounds like then, and just to make sure I understand, sounds like you're talking about transactional, which is the interaction part of it, versus, if you will, if there is a versus, but in terms of opposing, versus transformational, which is shifting from one thing to another at a constant state of growth in that sense.
Exactly. So first half is all about building the IQ and the specialization. Second half is actually utilizing that specialization through emotional intelligence.
So in organizations that are built on hierarchy and centralized authority, what do they express? What kind of development are they expressing?
Well, typically the older sort of established traditional type organizations would represent it in a hierarchy and express the transactional.
Okay.
There's a lot of sort of emerging new age companies which are more flat structured, all about agility of teams and also leadership immersion and engagement and empowerment. Leaders as coaches, which are a lot more transformational and fluid and adaptive.
Yeah, that'd be the whole self-management category of companies that I've been working with for some period of time. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about context a bit, because the context for these organizations is changing. The context for the transitional organization is changing. What happens if you're a transactionally designed company and poof, all of a sudden you are in a changing context? Do you even notice it, because transactional is so narrow a frame? Are you even going to notice it? How's the pressure of the transformation going to show up?
Well, I guess it's all about leadership. So, having a transformational leader will obviously impart on a transformational organization or a system change organization. So, if a leader is employed with a transformational mindset, then they will probably see the value of taking the organization down that road. In the more established businesses, which is probably a lot more hierarchical, you'll find that transactional leaders are pretty unaware of the actual value in transforming an organization into what is a more fluid, adaptive model, which is a lot more tuned to to growth opportunities.
Yeah, and that just exposes them completely to risk.
Yeah, exactly. Actually,
Yeah.
what you'll find, it's quite interesting in terms of the banking industry, which tends to be quite traditional. They tend to reference culture as risk culture, which is all about governance, and what I would perceive as quite transactional. Whereas more of the modern organizations will obviously reference culture in a completely different light. Which is more about growth and connection, a social understanding in terms of social skills and connecting strategy, and being more of a futurist and defining objective-based pathways forward. So completely different opposing perspectives.
Yeah. Now, how do we reconcile these? Because, if you kind of look at it compartmentally, you've got transactional leaders who are just not, they're narrow frame, therefore not capable of seeing what's going on. They're going to be the ones that are going to be resisting a wider view or something that requires more responsibility, because they'll be looking for safeguarding their power position, their position of authority. Well, a power position, not internal power, but, power over others at least. And then you've got the cultural, which is, in my world, it's always the container. It's shaping, informing, and influencing. How do you bring all this together so that these kinds of arcs in terms of human potential can be navigated successfully?
In terms of transforming the more traditional organizations, we've got to work on leaders so they can actually become aware of the power and the value in transforming what is a very traditional business into a more adaptive business. And, through my experience, it's not always easy. In terms of how I've actually targeted my business, I'm actually obviously targeting the HR profession, and maybe within that organization, within the more sort of established businesses, they're more capable and hopefully a little bit more aware of the actual benefits of providing a more agile, empowering organization where people have the freedom to grow and obviously to put forward their very unique perspectives.
Yeah, I think the word freedom and autonomy, in terms of one of the principles of both self-managed companies and companies that actually perform exceptionally well in these kinds of conditions we're in right now, is autonomy. It's that capacity to actually be able to plug in who you are and what you're capable of doing. So it's a fundamental shift.
Yeah, it's bringing your whole self to work, and it's also about being open-minded and being authentic and being who you are. And the more you sort of come to terms and know your capability and also your identity and begin to trust it, the more you can actually put it to work.
Right.
And if you have an accepting environment and if you're encouraged to partake and obviously reflect your individual perspectives, that can be quite powerful in a very accepting environment.
Absolutely. Now, I noticed, let me just put it this way. I noticed that in the coaching community, which is, one of the methods for helping develop these leaders and helping them take some stress off and, make it easier for them to work in these environments, that they completely ignore context. So they're always working on fixing the person. That's why there's this association with coaching and therapy, I suspect. But they kind of forget that the context is really just pushing this forward. What's going on there? I mean, how should, self-awareness and contextual awareness, being able to toggle between one situation and another, how should that be informing executive decision-making and executive behavior? What are you seeing there?
Yeah. With self-awareness, it essentially opens the mind. So, the objective of transitioning from what is the first half transactional mindset to the second half transformational mindset is actually surrendering the ego and breaking that down and becoming a lot more instinctive. So whereas the first half is about building a specialization, the second half is about being more generalist. So you can actually connect strategy and you can actually identify the capability within your organization. So going through a process where you can obviously work through and begin to trust your unique self and your authentic self, and begin to actually rationalize your instincts and become more generalist and big picture, is how we actually establish what I would term a one-to-one context, which is all about emotional intelligence and relationships. And that actually puts you at the center of every interaction, rather than obviously leading with the mind. You actually lead with the heart, and you're actually able to position yourself in the present, be a better listener, and speak with passion, because your intuition will guide you.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, as you well know, I love that, and I also just recently read Range, which was very validating for someone like me, because I moved through a variety of diverse contexts in the work I do, and which I love. I'd go crazy if I couldn't do that. But it was just that concept that you're special. You actually you become more innovative when you're moving through diverse contexts than you do if you're sitting in a specialized realm. And so, that whole business of being able to go wide and collaborative across diversity is incredibly powerful today, because we actually resolve uncertainty, or shall we say we work with it by being creative. We work with it by being rigid and sticking to the old rules, because they just don't work anymore.
Yeah, true. So within my book, and how I actually came about my framework, was what I represented within the first half was operations and administration functions were all about many associations, compliance, obviously, which would be service, and also sales functions, and even finance are more about one-to-many associations. HR is all about one-to-one relationships, and leadership is all about one-to-many associations in terms of context, very much inside out. So I built that around a life cycle, and that's also reflected in terms of management development. So obviously, many-to-many is all about a trainee. As we build our identity, team-based activities is all about building the many-to-one, and building strength of character, and all of those skills and processes that help build confidence. One-to-one is all about relationships, which is about a manager and them learning to actually coach and empower employees and also motivate them. And obviously, one-to-many is all about marketing, communications, influencing, inspiring, all of those sort of functional type activities. And the fact is, in terms of a whole system, as in terms of development, we need to learn all of those capabilities. And they do actually tend to reflect very different characteristics actually, as we move through those 4 quadrants.
Right. Interesting. We typically think about executives and managers in an organizational context, but everybody goes home at the end of the day. So how does what you've put together, this framework, then benefit managers and executives who are undergoing this radical change? For them, it's extremely radical change, because they've always been able to sit above and just say, hey, you guys go forth and change. I'm good. I don't have to be engaged in this. I'm exempt, when in fact not, because we know that the executive level and the management level are really where the block, that's where the layers that are blocking change, and they're expensive layers. So, if you're going to be in that role, then you have to be able to add value, which means you have to be able to shift. So how did their lives benefit from what we're talking about now and the framework you put together?
Yeah, actually, just stepping back, recent research proves that leaders are responsible for about 70% of a company's performance and success. So they tend to be very influential. So in terms of the second half, and in terms of leadership development and also management development, it's all about learning social connection and connecting strategically, and leading by objectives. So it does encompass more of a whole of mind approach, and it brings in all the analytical skills of the first half to actually express and be a lot more predictive in the second half. So, but the second half tends to be more about life skills, and the more you sort of come to terms with them, it's more about health and well-being as well. So it's the more you're self-aware, the more you can actually relinquish a lot of stress in your mind, because you understand your instincts and you can actually direct them purposely. So you know, there are a lot of health benefits.
So it sounds like it's more fulfilling.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
More,
Now,
as well as that, yeah, more fulfilling, and you know, being empowering of the business community and the employees. You know, you can actually improve a lot of people's lives.
which would be a nice legacy for anybody. When you talked about 70% leaders influencing 70% of the operating success, I mean, the first thing that comes in my mind is, which leaders are we talking about? Are we talking about the leaders in authority, or are we talking about the informal leaders that are actually leading, you know, in a company? I mean, the ones that you know, I mean, I've interviewed Andras Fishak with Org Mapper, where you actually map the networks of influence, you know, in terms of an organization. And it's almost never the leaders in authority who have the strongest leadership role. It is the janitor in the corner, or it's somebody that's a go-to. You know, they're not at the top.
Yeah.
They're elsewhere, and that's not to minimize the role of the CEO or the executive layer. It's just to say that people take their leadership from those who they actually see leading versus those that are in authority positions. So, you know, when you say that 70% statistic, who are we talking about there?
So we're talking about the leaders of the company, and
Okay.
and you know, that's up to 70%. And you know, the more a leader is an influencer and provides inspiration to their employees and sets bold, audacious visions and objectives, you know, the more the employees are going to respect that leader, and obviously they'll step up to support them as well. So probably in a lot of companies, a lot of leaders do not influence 70% of the organization, and they probably come in well under that percentile. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay,
As I
thank
said,
you.
potentially they can influence upwards of 70% of an organization's performance.
Right. It's there. The potential's there. Now, I want to go back to the brain part of this because, you know, in terms of fulfillment, we've talked about the heart, which is where fulfillment takes place. It's not in the brain, obviously.
Yeah.
But there is always this tendency that's kind of the old idea of left brain, right brain. And really what's really happening is we've got a whole brain, but there's more reliance on linear analytical thinking, perhaps over creative, and executives and management tend to look at their creative and go, that's play. You know, the value of design thinking is not fully appreciated at that executive level. So, and I think that's to a degree a bit of a function of how you perceive intelligence, you know, in left brain versus right brain. So when we talk about whole brain, what shift needs to happen so the perception is wider and you can take in more relevant data from the environment that you're working in?
Yeah. The way I see the brain working is it probably works as a whole unison in terms of function, but we need to actually purposely learn how to use it. So and that is represented in terms of the life cycle again. So infant, child, adolescent, adult is all about different frames and different intellectual processes. So and it works this way. It goes from copy, reflection, to observation, to inclination. And we will not learn all of those at once. So we need to actually focus our intellectual capacity on learning one of those stages at a time. And if we've, of course, fail any of those stages, then we need to go back and actually learn them. So as I mentioned before, we need to be analytical to be predictive. And the reality is we probably haven't mastered our inclination and leadership if we don't have a strong, structured, analytical mind to actually trend past events through to the future. So
that's using extrapolation then in that case.
yeah,
Is it not?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, which
Okay.
is exactly what inclination is.
Yeah.
And the important thing too is how we use our perception. So in the first half, when we're actually developing our and protecting our egos and managing our esteem and mastering our specialization, you know, we are quite what's the word? We can be quite self-critical. We can be full of self-doubt. We tend to actually protect ourselves and our personal space. So our perception is switched on to safety within the first half.
Yeah.
Not until the second half that we're actually a lot more self-confident. And when we do become self-aware, and a lot more secure in who we are, and we can actually leverage our capability automatically because we're now a generalist and we use our instincts. We then have the security of knowing who we are, so we can actually focus our perception on the future by setting, as I've mentioned, obviously big goals, big audacious goals. And what that actually enables the mind to do is to collect all the information within the environment without obviously having to protect the individual. So, and as soon as an aberration or an opportunity comes through with all of that data, which is exploding in the mind, you know, our instincts will actually identify it and help us to recognize that opportunity. So, and that's a very powerful thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I have to ask because, you know, I'm thinking of all the millennials and younger people that I just totally relate to because I love their way of thinking. I love their mind. How does this information sit on top of all of what we've been spending a lot of time talking about generational differences when in fact, you know, in a lot of instances, we've got a lot more wisdom and maturity in the younger generations than we've seen in the older ones. How does that sit?
Well, yeah, that's always a tough one, obviously.
Yeah, sorry.
Try not to offend too many people. You know, I think the baby boomers have just become complacent. You know, they were represented obviously during a time when things were really good, and you know, they have become very conservative mindsets, and you will find some of the biggest changes in cultures in this world and some of the most progressive cultures and probably in the most disrupted environments because people need to step up and they need to actually adapt and change to changing environmental circumstances. And you'll probably find that the UK, for instance, because of Brexit, is a lot more change ready than most organizations, especially here in Australia. We have a very complacent environment and people are very change resistant. So we're probably dominated by a lot of transactional thinkers, which is very evident in our government and some of our more established institutions. So yeah, so in terms of the millennials, you know, they've come up in an environment where they really need to actually fend for themselves. Things aren't as good for the millennials as it was for the baby boomers. You know,
it's more complex. I mean, we're working in far more complex environments than we've ever.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And, you know, they've also grown up with technology. I think maybe the baby boomers were confounded by technology, and that probably has made them a little bit more resistant to change, whereas obviously the millennials and our younger generations have grown up with it and they're more adaptive to it, and they probably use it a little bit more purposely. The only thing I would say about our younger generations is that for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's guilt or whatever it might be, but you know, us baby boomers have absolutely protected them, and we need to give them their freedom, and we need to obviously encourage them to realize their own independence. And that's something that I would encourage parents, and obviously you know, even within the workplace environment, just ensure that they have the freedom to make a difference and to actually open their minds and work purposely. You know, I think they're more likely to actually switch into the second half because maybe they may have failed some of the first half objectives. So,
Yes,
and
which cycles us back to autonomy and and being driven by a massively transformational purpose of sorts, you know, at a personal and corporate level or company level.
so, you know, they want to live by passion. They want to set their own purposeful objectives, and that's very different, obviously, to the baby boomers and people of our generation. So, and that's a fantastic thing, and it needs to be encouraged. But we also need to understand that, you know, we probably need to teach them more about self-confidence and learning the analytical side. I do note that the millennials do shy away from STEM subjects, and maybe that's a confidence thing. So, you know.
Yeah, and perhaps an educational design issue as well, because certainly the way a lot of education has been designed doesn't lend itself well for certain learners, you know, particularly in STEM subject matter. So, yeah. Now let's talk about tips for people listening to this program. What tips could you offer based on what your work is about and what you know this world is about right now? What would you offer to our listeners?
Yeah, we live in a very, very complex transactional world. You know, we're in what was the information age, which is now the digital age, and it's all about complexity and data and pretty much the transactional stage to compliant stage. You know, if we perceive ourselves as being too fixed and too transactional, then we need to go through the process of obviously freeing up our minds and becoming more open to our world, which is all about learning how to self-reflect and beginning to actually unravel what is our egos, and to actually do that, to actually respect who you are, have the confidence to actually move on, begin to actually understand and trust your instincts. You know, try and rationalize them. What I do actually do with my clients is for them to try and identify where they come from, because of course they don't just sit there out of the blue. They've come from somewhere. You know, intuition is about a lifetime of experiential learning, actions, you know, experiences, making decisions, you know, representing your likes and your dislikes and constantly reinforcing those. And, you know, that's why I actually state that your intuition is a reflection of your passion, because it's a lifetime of your likes and dislikes, and it will actually guide you in terms of your pathway forward. And the more you can actually define your passion, the more you can actually set purposeful objectives, and that will really fuel your mind. So, so definitely start with self-reflection. Obviously, get a really good behavioral coach, and just understand that some of the bigger picture objectives is about realizing and feeling more empathy. You know, in terms of developing your social mind, the second half, you know, try and be empathetic about a cause, to leverage those social skills. And with emotional intelligence, it's all about relationships and one-to-one interactions. So begin to relinquish the detail and adopt a more generalist mindset, and, you know, really explore those relationships. Act as a coach to people in your life, and also as a manager, and also a leader, and get to understand them through conversation. And the more you know about another person, the more you get to know about yourself. And self-awareness is all about knowing how other people's operates, because you get a very deep insight to understanding how you operate. So, so trust your intuition. You know, get comfortable with living in the moment and being present. Be a great listener, and start to empower your staff. And those social skills will build over time, and they'll help you in so many different ways. As I mentioned before, it'll help to control your stress, because you'll then learn how to actually understand those instincts and deal with that self-doubt and those negative thoughts, and you'll become a lot more positive. So that's the beginning of the emotional intelligence transformation. Understand that it's a completely different set of skills, and they actually oppose your original first half skill set. So it will require a change in mindset and a change in direction. So and in terms of building your leadership awareness, start setting those purposeful objectives around your passion, and you'll discover your passion as you begin to talk through them. Obviously, your conversation and reason through conversation with people, obviously within your work or within your private life.
Great suggestions. Thank you, Tony. What kind of, what have you got coming up, and do you want to send people anywhere for more information?
Actually, people can go to my website, tonyholmwood.com, if they want to actually explore more about my book. Actually, in terms of my consulting company, it's OutPerf4m.com. That's OUTPERF number 4 for 4 different development stages, m.com. So in the future, actually, I am currently working towards working with the World Business and Executive Coaching Summit to present there. I've got a pre-summit in May, which everybody is welcome to attend. And
that's free.
Yeah, that's free.
Yep.
And the actual paid 90-minute summit presentation is in November. So I'll put the details up on my website for people who want to sign up for that. And yeah, you'll find obviously all of this information within my book. So and there's a lot of very useful tips, especially around building a strong character and self-confidence in the first half. And the second half, there's an emotional intelligence program to actually help transition obviously to the very different mindset and enjoying the health and well-being benefits that come with it. So it's a very dynamic book and very thought-provoking. So I hope the readers enjoy it. So that's available on my website and all book outlets, as you'd expect. And the other thing too is I provide a very innovative approach, and I'm currently looking for strategic partners to pitch my transformational leadership programs into organizations. So if anybody is listening who has connections to obviously a coaching company or obviously a large consulting firm who obviously resonates with my approach, then please get in contact. And yeah, I would love to start talking. Well, I'm already in discussions with people about partnerships, but I definitely want to try and actually accelerate the programs and hopefully move to a very different paradigm on leadership development and transformational leadership. It
Super.
will make a very big difference to this world.
Yeah, that's what we're here for. Absolutely. Tony, thanks very much for being on the program. Delightful to chat with you.
Yeah, you too, Dawna. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate having the opportunity.